Good morning, and thanks for being here. We've heard from Dan about the national security risks that are inherent in a very open program of admitting foreign students in very large numbers. And we've heard from David about the pipeline of additional workers that is opened up by the existence of, by all of these foreign students together with the OPT program. What I want to focus on this morning is the fact that the student visa program has the highest rate of overstaying of other programs, other visa programs. In other words, those who come here on student visas are more likely not to go home, are more likely to violate the terms of their visa and stay on illegally. So this is contributing to our illegal immigration problem. I'm going to talk about how many, who is the law enforced against, and why, and give you some recommendations at the conclusion. And when we talk about student and exchange overstays, this refers to people who come on an what's known as an F visa, basic student visa, which can be for college or graduate school, but also can be for high school or really any public elementary or secondary education, just any school. We also have what's known as the M visa, which is for vocational institutes, including things like flight schools, but also beauty schools and acting schools and dog grooming schools and the like. And another program or set of programs really that many aren't aware of, which is the J visas for exchange visitors, most of whom are actually working in the country, some of whom are engaging in academic exchanges such as the Fulbright program, but the vast majority of whom, of this more than 300,000 people coming in each year, are working. This is au pairs, camp counselors, lifeguards, teachers, postdocs, doctors, all sorts of occupations that people are working in under the guise of an exchange program. So the Department of Homeland Security several years ago began publishing the data that it has collected from an entry-exit tracking system that's been developed. And we know how many people, or at least we have an estimate of how many people are not leaving at the expiration of their visas. And in 2018, it was about 670,000 people did not depart at the time that their visa expired. So this is an enormous number of people who are not complying with the terms of their visas. 69,000 people who had entered on student or exchange visas in 2018 did not depart at the conclusion of their visa. Now, those numbers are reduced over time. About a year after the period of time covered by the Department of Homeland Security's report, a significant number of those people had either left the overstay population or adjusted to another status. And if you refer to the handouts, the second page of the handout has a chart that's taken from a report I did on the DHS overstay report. And you can see the numbers in various categories. It's called Overstays 2015 to 2018. Those numbers do decline over time, as I mentioned. But we don't know why some of those people drop off the suspected overstay list, whether it was because they left on their own, adjusted status, or transitioned into optional practical training or some other status, or maybe applied for an immigrant visa. So you can see, again, that student and exchange visitors are the least compliant of all of our temporary visa admissions. The next page there, are actually maybe your first page, because I think these are a little out of order. There's a table that shows the worst, the countries and with the worst numbers of people staying over and the worst rates of compliance, because it's important to talk about both of these. Some countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and South Korea, have on paper better rates of compliance, but because we admit so many students from those countries, even a small percentage of people who overstay translates into a very large number of visa violators. And in the case of China, leads the list with, in 2018, almost 13,000 people overstayed their visa that year in the student and exchange visitor category. Other countries are a problem because of the extremely poor compliance rates, and we don't issue a lot of visas in these countries, but it's a problem because we have countries like, for example, Eritrea, where more than half of the people who got a student or exchange visa don't go home. And it's 40 people, but it's still, you have to ask yourself, why are we issuing so many visas in a country where more than half the people are not going to comply? And some of these countries are countries of concern because of national security considerations, the fact that they don't have robust identification programs, and for that reason show up on, some of these are travel ban countries that are on this list. So those are the reasons that this is important. I should also add that list of countries with the highest overstay numbers, those 5 countries, represent 44% of all visa overstayers. So we've got a double problem here with, the other thing is that some of these countries on this list are what are known as recalcitrant countries who do not accept their citizens back for deportation if we were to actually locate and arrest and try to remove them. ICE is sometimes stymied by these countries because they don't accept them back. So all of these raise questions as to why we continue to issue visas in such large numbers in many of these countries. What I've also noticed by looking at the trends in the overstay report, and we've got now 3 good years of data on student and exchange visitors, is that sometimes you can see that even when the number of visas that we're issuing has been reduced, the overstay rates are still very high. So it helps to reduce the number of visas that are being issued because it keeps the overstay numbers down, but there's still a bad bet for a visa because they're still staying over in very high rates. And that means we need to think about something other than just issuing fewer visas if we're going to get a hold of the overstay problem. And that would be stronger enforcement of the laws that we have against overstaying. I also prepared a chart that meshes Dan's list from his report of the countries of concern who are getting large numbers of student visas with the overstay rates. And again, we can see very large numbers from countries of concern for espionage like China and Iran, and countries of national security concern like Saudi Arabia, for example, but also quite a few countries with double-digit non-compliance rates like Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, and so on. Why are students in particular a concern for us? Because the numbers are small relative to some other visa categories like regular temporary visa holders. Well, and these are not the highest numbers. Student visa overstays represent about 5% of the entire overstay population. Well, as Dan mentioned, part of the reason is because they're admitted for a long period of time and with relatively little supervision. The other reason this is important is because coming on a student visa is a good pretext for a young person to gain admission to the United States. Because of our visa laws, most of the young people who are getting student visas would not qualify for a temporary visa on their own because of the fact that they're young, maybe not in stable employment, considered a high risk for overstaying. But if they can get a college, community college or vocational school or exchange program to accept them as participants or enroll them as students, it's not that difficult to get a student visa. And of course, there are the known associations of this program with terror. A number of the 9/11 terrorists were foreign students, and others, the known association with espionage. But also, because of this, the fact that it's a good way for someone who wouldn't otherwise qualify for a visa to get into the country, there are numerous fraud schemes that have arisen in connection with student and exchange visas. David has documented very well the large number of, shall we say, non-rigorous programs that exist in the country, that admit people which are basically diploma mills, quite honestly, that are given the authorization by ICE in the Department of Homeland Security to accept foreign students. We have, there was, in fact, recently a sting in Detroit with a bogus school that ICE's HSI had set up. And there were hundreds of foreign students who participated in that. There are problems with, in particular with Chinese nationals, facilitators who develop schemes to, which involve, they're very complex, involve getting imposters to take entrance exams in China, false passports issued to facilitate the entry of people who wouldn't qualify for a student visa otherwise, who get into the country. And again, hundreds of thousands. David has estimated in his report that there may be as many as 40,000 individuals who've gotten into the United States through a fraudulent or bogus student visa program, and then have access to the optional practical training program and so on, and just disappear into the woodwork. And this contributes to illegal immigration. And our government has developed a way to track which students do not maintain status in their university, which may not have rigorous academic programs. And so we do know that a lot of this goes on, and yet ICE devotes very little of its resources to enforcing the law against programs like this. Very explicitly, ICE has said that its overstay enforcement is limited to those students that are considered to be a national security or public safety threat. Everyone else is pretty much ignored. The chance, I recently had a FOIA request of the last 5 years of ICE's deportation records, in which one of the bits of information that I asked for was the immigration status of individuals being deported. And what I found was that in 2018, for example, ICE removed 170 individuals whose status was a student or exchange visitor, which is a tiny number out of the huge population of 1 million foreign students. I calculated it's about 0.4% of student visitors who go out of status, who overstay, face any threat of enforcement. That's minuscule, and I would argue that such a low rate of removals is not just not a deterrent, but that's an actual incentive for people to try to gain admission as a foreign student to get here, because they know that there's very little chance of enforcement. And again, I've put some charts in your packets that talk about, well, who is ICE going after? Of these, it's in the last 3 years, 414 individuals identified as students who were removed from the United States. The largest number from Saudi Arabia, some also from China, Kenya, India, Nigeria, Jordan, and a scattering of other countries. This kind of enforcement is not actually happening in the ICE field offices that are traditionally known for the highest numbers of deportations, like in California and Texas. Most of them, interestingly, were from the Seattle field office. Also a lot in Detroit, Chicago, Miami, and other places. And I believe this is because of ICE's hyper-focus on national security and public safety threats. I was able to see in the data the reasons, like the program of arrest. In other words, what type of removal cases these individuals were. And about half of them apparently came from referrals from the SEVIS program, which is our tracking system for foreign students. Only about a fifth of them were criminals. 4 of them were referrals from Joint Terrorism Task Force investigations. A lot of the rest came from border inspections. And some people might look at that and say, oh, well, 4, there were only 4 who were terrorist threats. I look at that and say, yikes, there were 4 who potentially were terrorists. This level of enforcement is not helping us maintain the integrity of our immigration system, and it's creating an extremely large haystack for counterterrorism officials. And to address this, ICE really needs to take a much broader approach to enforcing overstays and noncompliance with visas. Beyond national security and public safety concerns, we gather all this information on the number and who has overstayed. They need to start using it for more routine compliance. Of course, you want to focus on the fraud schemes and the national security threats, but there's room in ICE's resources to go beyond that and start being actually calling people in to talk who have not overstayed. And Congress needs to help also by giving the government some more tools to use, such as sanctions for the schools and the employers and the exchange program sponsors that are offering participation to these individuals. And I'll leave it at that. I have a page of recommendations in your packets. But this needs to happen. The way ICE does overstay enforcement, it ignores most people and goes after a small handful. If it were to broaden its approach, not only would it catch people who were just routine overstayers, but we know from experience, you also end up catching a lot of people who are a threat that you just didn't know about. And this is critically important going forward to our immigration system. Thanks.